Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jed Friedlander. I'm a managing partner and head of business development for Phoenix Infrastructure. I want to welcome my distinguished panelists, Brian Ansari from Brian Ansari and Associates, and James Eklund from Eklund Hanlon. I want to first do introductions and ask you guys to describe how you think about ESG and in particular with respect to water infrastructure. I can start with an introduction. Phoenix is a minority-owned infrastructure investor. Started fairly recently, a couple of years ago. The first P3 project we won as a investor developer is the Charlotte Gateway project in North Carolina. We think about ESG really. We think about sustainability in terms of environmental sustainability, of course, but also social sustainability and financial sustainability. So look to participate in, develop projects that really hit on all three of those priorities. Personally, I've been in the infrastructure space for about 20 years. First half as a lawyer, most recent half as a developer, leading teams on long-term public-private partnerships to design, build, finance, operate, maintain critical infrastructure projects. My original experience in this space and my original interest in water actually dates back to law school when I studied. I think the first project finance case study I looked at was in Cochabamba, Bolivia, a privatization of the municipal water system by an international consortium. They ran a procurement process that only one team responded to. This was more of a privatization than a P3. But the concession ultimately, the privatization ultimately had some fixed return thresholds and a need for the private consortium to recoup their investment, their substantial investment in improving the Bolivian water system over the term, which led to immediate increases, vast increases in charges that were imposed upon the residents in Cochabamba, and including some villages that thought that they had spent money invested privately in building wells, for example, for their own personal consumption, and found those wells metered and found that they were paying what for them was exorbitant costs for water. This led to what was known at the time as the water war in Bolivia, which ultimately massive protests, several deaths, led to the toppling of the president resigned, it was a lesson in, first of all, how interesting project finance can be for me, but also how these projects can really fail and monumentally fail when they don't consider ESG, when that's not incorporated into the building blocks of the project, the procurement, the approach, establishing the parameters of it, not to mention actually executing the project. The failure there was really that this was imposed from the Bolivian government, which was imposed onto them by the World Bank because they were a debtor country, and then by the Bolivian government onto the city of Cochabamba, which is the third largest city in Bolivia. And again, this was a surprise for everyone who was affected by the water increases. There was no explanation. People just saw what they thought was a significant investment really taken away from them. I think I just want to really set that out as for how we think about ESG, water in particular, is such a vital resource, and how these considerations, that's really a governance failure among others, but how these considerations really need to be critical in how we think about these projects. So I look forward to talking about it with my panelists, and I want to kick it to Brian Ansari for intros, please.
Thank you very much, Ed. I am Brian Ansari, president of Brian Ansari and Associates. We are a national management consulting firm that works with We have two clients. We have the public owners, and we work with public owners to help them to frankly implement ESG as relates to supply chain and ensuring the equitable participation of minority, women-owned, disadvantaged-owned businesses in their supply chain. And we also work on the project side. On the project side, we deliver solutions for SPVs and for design build JVs to support them in not only how they meet their MW, SDVOB, or even DBE goals, but helping them in supporting the program management. So we have a twofold solution. One is the kind of front end related to community engagement, workforce development, overall pursuit strategy, outreach, compliance, monitoring, that whole suite of services that typically measures and builds the infrastructure and governance for performance by MW DBEs on projects. And then we also, in the construction phase, deliver solutions around program management. So we provide an integrated offering that kind of embeds the MWDB value proposition in a holistic way on the project side to support project clients to deliver their mega projects in a way that is designed to achieve not only the success of the MWDB goals, but also to engage the stakeholders in ways that they have not been invested before. So thank you very much for that, Tony.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, Jed and Brian. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you guys. I'm James Eklund. I'm the founder of Eklund Hanlon, a water law and policy firm based here in Colorado and focused on water in the U.S. West generally. I come to this panel and this issue having spent most of my career in public service, in the public sector with the state of Colorado. There's a senator with a funny last name, Hickenlooper. I was legal counsel to him when he was governor, and ran the state water agency and worked in the Colorado Attorney General's office for a spell. ESG has found or is finding its way into every single facet of an infrastructure project. Certainly was the case in water policy. I'm putting some distance between me and my stint with the state of Colorado now. I've been out of there for a little over 4 years, but it definitely was something that was coming to the fore, and I think has only accelerated in terms of its importance and in policy making. But in the private sector, from procurement to financial close, and certainly has to be included and addressed as a suite of issues. ESG does by the full spread of private sector players on a water project. So excited to be here. It's annual meeting season and proxy voting season. So I'm excited I think our timing is really good to have this conversation. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for that. So let's I think dive right into the topic here. I think so much of the infrastructure that we work on is about really increasing efficiency, optimization, lowering cost of goods sold. Water projects are different. They're about providing the most fundamental human need, ensuring health, human safety. If water is a human right, I want to talk about some ways that I want to talk about what responsibilities come with that right. And I think those responsibilities are wrapped up in fundamental ESG concerns that the public sector is aware of, increasingly aware of, in looking to procure these projects and to provide water to their residents. And these ESG concerns we've seen more and more are influencing capital decisions and procurement decisions. The backdrop is a water crisis. I think we're reading more about it every day. I want to start with Brian and maybe touch on there are several very high profile municipal water crises, Flint being kind of the poster child. I wonder if you can speak about whether it's appropriate, how to maybe view those through an ESG lens, how you understand them through an ESG lens.
Absolutely, thank you. I think in Flint and in Jackson, Mississippi, as well as in Newark, New Jersey, you see that, at least in those instances, water became an issue when there was a crisis, when the lead pipes, produce, lead outcomes in communities that were, presenting a significant health hazard. And it's interesting, municipalities will tolerate a certain amount of water loss for pipes that are not operating efficiently, but there's very little thought sometimes about the environmental danger of having lead pipes as the primary water infrastructure. So when I think about ESG, that's the kind of the first in the E is what is the impact, and then those communities that are being impacted by the lead pipes tend to be older, often established cities or cities that have older infrastructures. Newark and Jackson, and Flint, are certainly most recent examples, but this is not this issue is not unique. And so we're talking about health issues that are stemming from, what, the outdated infrastructure. When we look at, from a governance standpoint, it's what role does government have to not only ensure the maintenance of a viable water infrastructure, but what's their responsibility with respect to how they're thinking about upgrading or enhancing it, to the extent that it's a conversation about just acquiring a new infrastructure. That certainly will meet the minimum needs of building the resource. However, these same communities also suffer from a certain amount of economic neglect or benign neglect. Certainly in the case of Newark, in the case of Jackson, and in the case of Flint, you see communities that have a very high level of unemployment, tend to be disproportionately people of color, and there's an impact that's being not just from a physical standpoint, but economically. And to the extent that there's a thought about how public procurement can be used to create opportunities for those communities to be part of their own long-term destiny, then governance becomes an asset. It becomes a way to be able to not just provide the initial asset, the performing asset to the community, but a way for them to be part of the long-term solution, either in providing the services to design those services, or to put them in the ground, or to operate and maintain them. There's a lot of kind of revenue that's coming off of the creation of any kind of infrastructure. And to the extent that there's a commitment that recognizes that there's not just an obligation to provide the infrastructure, but to provide it in an equitable, responsible way, that goes to the G. And then to go into the S, we're talking about social impact. And so, this kind of dovetails into the G in the governance and looking at equitable participation. If there's a thoughtful consideration of how and who's going to participate in the building of the replacement infrastructure, for water, then you have the unique opportunity to be able to invite classes of communities that have historically not participated in building infrastructure to participate, even if they participate in a limited way, but a way that's intentional, and that puts the seeds in for these individuals within this community to be able to have long-term participation opportunities. For example, O&M, being able to look at O&M, particularly on the P3. I know there's a P3, not a P3, there's a large design build that just came out recently from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, actually for the LaGuardia AirTran. And one of the really unique things about that is that they have an 80% local workforce requirement on the actual O&M. So, they clearly are seeing their the building of this new infrastructure as a way to create local employment. So employment is a very fundamental, aspect of how these communities can survive and address, even some of the other issues that are present. So that speaks to the S. So we have a full complement of how ESG can be addressed in these instances.
I think that's a great example. I like that you mentioned the Port Authority where they have also, and I'm not sure about that deal that you mentioned specifically, but in other deals they've had a requirement for minority investment as well, which is something we do, and obviously think it can be a huge advantage to some of these projects. And we also actively look for ways to get stakeholders, local residents, to invest in the long-term success of these projects. I'm going to kick it to James now, because I think we talked about some of the municipal crises that often come from underinvestment or decisions that are made at a municipal level, but there are also regional crises as well that are very pressing, that come from scarcity, from drought, from overuse. You're intimately acquainted with some of those. I want to touch on that, and I think maybe distinguish the fault isn't maybe an ESG failure, but how we bring ESG into the consideration of maybe what can be done to react to some of these crises.
Yeah, I think you put it real well, Jed, and Brian. I like the examples you've given. I'm taking notes fast here and furiously, but it's the old Winston Churchill saying, "Never waste a crisis," and obviously you never wish for the effects of climate change and drying soils and drought and all that that comes with aridification and that on the environmental side, nor do you wish for the type of racial tension that we have witnessed here in the U.S. For many, many decades now, maybe ever since we started this experiment of American democracy. But what does present itself is an opportunity to do the types of policy making and make decisions based on how you run your business if you're in the private sector, and how you deliver a project if you're talking about a P3, in a way that is really accounting for the true value of a project, and the costs need to be real and dealt with. And for too long, we've allowed costs when it comes to ESG related issues to be outsourced or to be separated from a project or a company. And I think the wonderful opportunity that we have in this discussion that we're in the midst of is really injecting ESG front and center into questions about value and cost and risk tolerance, risk transfer, all the things we've talked about for years in the P3 space. All of those have attributes that ESG can really add value to and clarification around. And so, the examples I think of all the time are water-based, as you'd guess, whether you're talking about in the South, Texas, Mississippi, the Colorado River Basin, which, as you noted, is near and dear to me. Our soils are drying globally in places where we grow food. And I've even kind of gone out on the limb and invented a word. My kids will tell you I do that a lot, but I call this effect of drying soil spongification. And if you look at the Colorado River Plateau, and I know when we're usually all in San Diego at this conference, it's front of mind because we're right there in the arid Southwest, and if you look at the Colorado River Plateau, you can actually see in the data, in the hydrograph, big snow years, or better than average snow years. 115% of average was what we were last year in 2020, the water year that we just experienced. And runoff, you usually expect to be about average. If you're above average, if you're 115% of average snowpack, you'd expect your runoff to be just about that. And maybe a little bit less, but not too much less. We were at 55-ish% of average runoff last year. With that great snowpack or relatively good snowpack, we produced a really less than desirable runoff pattern. And I use that as an example because in the environmental part of ESG, we've got a disproportionate impact that our policies and our infrastructure generally are having on communities of color. And it's true. And I know Brian and you, Jed, can speak better to this than I can, but the voice at the table has to be incorporated into the discussion. And I know we're going to talk more about that, but I think, the examples of the pandemic showing that our batting average just isn't very hot when it comes to the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the correlation along racial lines is high, and it's pervasive. We've got a big challenge in front of us on each of E, S, and G suites of issues, and I keep coming back to if you're in water in general, no matter what sector you're in, public or private, you are probably an optimist, a glass is half full type of person, and that's seeing this as an opportunity and not just as a suite of challenges, I think is important.
Thank you for that. I think you're right. You do have to be an optimist in water. There have not been, particularly if you're a P3 developer, there have not been a lot of P3 water projects, many less successful P3 water projects. But this panel is about P3 and ESG. So let's pivot it and go to that issue. Let's talk about ways that P3 can be a useful tool in ensuring that some of these ESG priorities that we've discussed are fundamentally bound up in water procurement and delivery. We can talk through some lessons learned. I think we've mentioned a couple of projects already. Again, there's limited projects to draw from, but we can talk about lessons learned and also look at other types of projects to inform really, I think, this opportunity to think about water procurement in a little bit of a different way. So James, I'm going to start with you and maybe ask some specific projects, if there are examples that you would draw from that you think got it wrong, could do better, maybe aspects that we can learn from.
Yeah, you bet. So I love me some public sector just as much as the next person, but the pace at which we need public policy to change and really the regulatory environment to change to address our challenges just in water, and you can apply this probably to infrastructure generally, it's just not quick enough. The public sector's got a lot of great attributes about it. Being responsive and quick is not necessarily always what we think of. And the private sector, on the other hand, that's exactly why public-private partnerships thrive when they're applied, is because you've got that innovation and that ability to move at a quicker pace on the private side. So the examples I always come up with, and I apologize for doing this to you guys, but are always in the Colorado River Basin. And one of the examples that comes to mind when you're teeing this up, Jed, is the Salton Sea. The Colorado River Basin, as everybody probably knows, is massive. 250,000 square miles. It's 40 million people rely on this one basin on this one river. It's the hardest working river in the country. I'm fond of saying. I didn't grow up on the Mississippi, so maybe there are people that would disagree with that. But in terms of the size of this river, it's a relatively small river. I mean, it's a tenth the size of the Columbia, for example. So it's not a big river when it comes to volume, but when it comes to its importance to a region, it's just the lifeline for many, many communities. Almost all communities in the southwest part of the country. So the Salton Sea is an interesting example because it's I think an example of unintended consequences, things that happened back before we were really injecting ESG types of analyses into our thinking and I apply that across the board from the public sector and the private sector. We weren't thinking in the terms that we are today, and what happened was, we have a sea that has been there for a long time, since the banks of the Colorado River basically gave way and allowed the flow of the entire river to flow into that sink that's below sea level for a few years, until we patched up the river bank and turned off the spigot. But then we put the Imperial Irrigation District sits right on the edge of the Salton Sea. And when they ran the water through the canal and onto the fields, and then the tailwater, the return flows, what you'd usually call them, after the plants are done using what they need, and the water that's left over goes in to recharge the Salton Sea. That's why it's there. Well, when you sell a bunch of that water to San Diego, where we're usually at this conference, then the flow of the return flows into the Salton Sea go down. And as they went down, it was clear that the soil that was usually covered with water was susceptible to going airborne when the wind would blow. And those particulates have resulted in the highest amount of respiratory illness in the country in that part of California. And that is, a racial issue as well. A vast majority of the people in that area are of color, and that means that this becomes an ESG issue very, very quickly. So I throw that out as an example. I don't want to go any further on it because I'm chewing up more time than I intended to, but you can look at any place you have water scarcity or water stress, and usually when the pie of pain is divvied out, the vast majority of that pain falls on the shoulders of people of color and the environment. And that's why we have a real opportunity in front of us when we're talking about water infrastructure practices and projects going forward here.
Right, and of course the most disadvantaged populations are the ones that are least able to relocate in response to a crisis like what you're mentioning. Brian, I think maybe we can touch on what some of these communities can do, what maybe they have done in order to be heard when we're facing some of these issues. How can they have a seat at the table? Are there any causes for optimism here?
Thank you. A lot of the stress on infrastructure is not new. One of the interesting things about President Biden's proposal for infrastructure is some of the efforts to integrate climate change responses into the infrastructure bill. Now, I know for a fact that the city of New York is just started a major project related to storm hardening. Now, how is that related to the question? I'll tell you. There's a role for the public owner that's going to be sponsoring these projects to bring in advisors that help them to understand the full landscape. I think often the landscape tends to reflect, the project needs and the project design, but it doesn't really always take into consideration who's going to be impacted. They delay the impact till the project actually occurs and put a lot of burden on the community engagement portion of the project versus kind of, having an opportunity to really kind of, use their advisory resources to better understand how to ensure that everyone is included in the conversation. Give an example in Newark. When Newark, first had the crisis, they received a emergency designation from the feds. The state mobilized resources, and they immediately went into action. And what they did was they created a series of emergency contracts. Those emergency contracts, the market was ready to absorb them, but they absorbed them in a way where no one in the community really was able to. None of the businesses in the community were able to participate in that windfall, in that opportunity. And I think, thinking about this both in terms of making meaningful connections at the community level sets the table for how you're going to be responding when things occur. And I think that, I actually had conversations with some of the people, conversations with people in the city of Newark, trying to understand how to get more MWDBEs to the supply chain. And one of the things that I learned was that, these contracts had already been put out, and there was very little time or consideration being given to equity in contracts that were sometimes, tens or if not, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so creating, understanding that, there's a role for the businesses in your community to play in, all your contracting vehicles, is really important. I think with Flint, there was actually a minority-owned business, a minority woman-owned business that was able to get a very, very significant contract. And to the best of my knowledge, she was the only one that got it. Whether she got it because she was of the scale to be able to respond to the emergency contract, I don't know. But being intentional about who you want to benefit and how the distribution of these resources is going to occur is fundamental to ensuring that these ESG commitments are satisfied, because it's bad enough that these communities have to bear the burden of inadequate or outdated or dysfunctional infrastructure. But now they, if an opportunity comes up for them to be able to be part of the conversation and figure out how the solutions are going to be developed, that opportunity is not there. And then lastly, when it comes to delivering the solution, they're not able to participate in the solution delivery. So, you're getting kicked 3 times, and you don't have an opportunity to be able to really voice your frustration, or even, exercise your voice in ensuring that, that the concerns that you have as a community, or even as an individual, as a family, get expressed. And then even individuals you want to attract to the community, are now thinking twice about even coming. In fact, it's interesting that in Newark, there's a lot of real estate development taking place. And, I believe, from what I understand, there were the developers went out of their way to create special accommodations to ensure that the values of their properties didn't go down because of this water crisis. And in fact, the building of Newark has started up again in earnest. So the community is recovered, but the intent is what's going to be the echo that's going to come from responding to these crises with respect to community impact, community trust, community participation, and community investment. I mean, I think Jed said something earlier about the whole notion of having the participation of minority women-owned businesses in every facet of the projects of these infrastructure projects. To the extent that P3s are going to be a solution, then it makes no sense at all not to have a MWE equity partner if they're in the market and they're able to participate. Not just because they're MWE, but because you bring a level of IQ to your team that you wouldn't have otherwise had, and frankly, being able to select individuals who have different points of view than your own, and that are not just focused on cost or technical, but actually help you to be a better citizen and to be able to, deliver these cost and technical solutions in a way that shows that you have the commitment to social equity that many people say they have, but when push comes to shove, when it comes between green and social equity, often green wins out.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the lessons I've had in the 20 years of doing this is that opposite of what happened in Bolivia, the best projects start from the ground up. They start organically. They're driven by community outreach, community engagement. Sometimes these are regional projects, and the same applies there. And what you're talking about is not only having that community inform how the project is structured, what it looks like, identifying what the objectives are, but also having members of that community participate in its success, and thereby keep that link with the community going forward. I think, James, I think that is a good sort of way to talk about maybe some positive lessons that we've seen, and we're nearing the end here, so we'll end on a positive note, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got a Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who is a tribal member, and my great-great-grandparents rolled into the western slope of Colorado in 1888 from Norway, kind of escaping a depression, and settled land that was belonged to the Ute Indians, and teepee poles were still standing on the land when they did roll into that area. All of our water policy that we have made over the last 100 plus years on the Colorado River, going clear back to the 1922 compact, was made by, no offense, old white guys. And I guess I am one, so I can say that. The reality is that everyone needs water. Without 3 days without this stuff and you're done. So men and women, so there's got to be gender diversity. There's got to be racial diversity, voices at that table. And having our first Secretary of the Interior, who is from Indian country, knows the issues in the southwestern part of the country, she's from New Mexico, and that's really optimistic. That's a cause for a lot of optimism. Really excited about that, and just hearing Brian talk, I think the other place where there's optimism and good things to end on here is in the area of racial equity auditing. We audit companies. Every company at this conference, I guarantee, does a financial audit. And the reason you do a financial audit is because it lends legitimacy and strength, especially if you've got shareholders, to your financial performance. The same is true of ESG. And especially with respect to racial diversity, equity, inclusion issues. There's no reason why an outside independent audit can't be done on a project, on a company, and really lend legitimacy and demonstrate that company or that project is walking the talk with respect to these issues. Just like Brian said, instead of coming in and putting all the emphasis on a stakeholder process that may be bound for failure, destined for failure, because it's coming in at the end and the cake's been already baked. People want to be in the kitchen. They want to have a say in how that thing's being mixed and what the temperature of the oven is and all those good things. And we have the opportunity now to do that. So I would implore everybody at our beloved Water P3 conference to think about a pivot to doing it differently when it comes to their projects. And I'm sure Brian is standing by to help with that. So I think that there is, to answer your question head on, Jed, there is definitely a cause for optimism, and there's a bright future, I think, for water infrastructure if we can do some of this implementation of ESG throughout the span of the project.
Wonderful. I think that, Brian, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I would like to say one thing to the if we have any funders or funds in the audience. The measures for what ESG look like, SABA and other tools that are being used to gauge ESG impact. I would say that that's the beginning of the journey. It's not the end of the journey. So thinking about, what kinds of things that you can do from creating an ESG scorecard that is actually going to have impact. Because I think, there's always a tendency for all of us to drift toward vanity metrics. We want to be able to appear that we're doing well. We want people to see us as doing well. But then there's the actual price that's paid for what doing well actually means. The Bible says, there's two things: love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. The notion of loving your neighbor requires a sacrifice, and to the extent that there's an understanding that progress requires some sort of sacrifice, and that true engagement and true commitment to ESG is going to look very different than what you've done before. Is something needs to take into consideration, both whether you are a funder, whether you're a recipient of funds, whether you're a SPV, whether you're a designer. There's a role for everyone to play. So I certainly would encourage those who are within the sound of my voice to pick up that mantle. If I may say, it's a battle standard. So you see the flag laying on the ground, pick it up and go into battle, knowing that you're having the courage of conviction that this is your moment, this is your opportunity to really show what your company and what you as an individual, as a community, are made of, and what commitment really looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I think to underscore that point, these ESG priorities, they don't encumber projects. They don't have to. These are actually meant to move projects forward, because we think that the best projects do happen with this community support, and particularly in the water space, where there's 150,000 plus water systems in the U.S. Those are a lot of those are community-based systems. There's more opportunity here, I think, to have this more organic approach to meld what you guys are talking about with respect to ESG standards, SASB or otherwise, and community standards coming from the ground up, meet in the middle, and really produce something that has better outcomes for everybody involved. Leave it there, guys. Any more thoughts?
Awesome. I really appreciated the conversation. Thanks for teeing it up, Jed and Brian. Words of inspiration there. I like it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Brian, James.